There are moments in life when silence holds more weight than words. Not because nothing is said, but because something unspoken lingers, changing the air itself. I didn't expect a moment like that. On an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the day began quietly. The kind of day that slips past without anyone noticing. The kind of day where the world seems content to move on without you. I was in the kitchen, hands deep in flour, kneading bread the way Robert always liked it. The smell of yeast rose warm into the air. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, laying soft golden stripes across the table. The radio hummed low in the corner, a song from years gone by. Outside, the maple leaves whispered, and I thought of Robert. 8 years since he left me. 8 years of empty chairs. And dinners for one. I sometimes told myself I had grown used to the quiet. But truthfully, the silence still pressed heavy, louder than his laughter once was. If you've ever known that kind of silence, the kind that fills a room so completely, you can almost hear your own heartbeat. I'd love for you to stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, so each time I share a true story from my life, you'll have a place where the silence is never yours to carry alone. Then it came. The knock. 3 soft raps against the door. Not hurried. Not demanding. Just enough to pull me from the rhythm of my thoughts. I wiped my hands on my apron, puzzled. The neighbor children never knock without their mother. My daughter always calls first. And the mailman leaves things quietly in the box. I opened the door. And for a moment I froze. It was Frank. My late husband's best friend. Time had bent his shoulders slightly. His hair was silver now, but his eyes, those same steady eyes I remembered from summers long ago, were still kind. "Meg," he said, his voice roughened with age, yet warm. "I was nearby, and thought I'd check on you." I hadn't seen him in months, maybe longer. The last time was at Robert's grave. We stood together then, sharing a silence heavier than words. 2 old souls bound by grief. But no more than that. At least I thought so. A ripple stirred in my chest. Not quite ache. Not quite comfort. Something unnamed waiting. "You never interrupt, Frank," I managed. "You're always welcome here." He stepped inside slowly, as if the house itself might resist. His eyes wandered across the familiar walls. The mantel with framed photographs. The armchair Robert once claimed each evening. The Afghan folded neatly over the couch. Everything still in its place. Everything except Robert. For a moment, Frank lingered by the fireplace. His gaze softened at the photo above it. Robert in his fishing hat. Me laughing at his side. Sunlight sharpened our smiles. "I remember that day," Frank said quietly. "We drove out to the lake. Robert insisted on racing the ducks." I felt my throat tighten. "Yes," I whispered. "He always did." The silence stretched again. Thick with memories. Not empty. Never empty. Full of everything we hadn't said. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Bread's almost ready. Would you like some tea?" He nodded. "I'd like that." I set the kettle to boil. The sound filled the air like a heartbeat. Frank sat at the table, his large hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked at me with something gentle, something I couldn't name. I poured the tea carefully, steam curling upward, carrying the scent of chamomile. He wrapped his fingers around the cup, holding it as though it might steady him. His eyes drifted again to the photographs on the wall. Robert and I, young, sunburnt, smiling. The children, small once, grown now. Years caught in frames. "You two were happy," he said softly. I swallowed hard. Yes, we had our struggles. But he loved me in a way that never left me doubting. Frank traced the rim of his cup, his expression unreadable. For a long while he said nothing. Then his gaze lifted, meeting mine with a weight I hadn't seen before. "Meg," he began, his voice lower now, careful, deliberate. "There's something I've carried for years. Something I never told Robert." The words hung in the air. The kettle clicked off behind me. The clock ticked on the mantel. But everything felt suspended, the room holding its breath. And in that moment, I knew this visit wasn't just a friendly call. It was something more. Something heavier. Something that had waited decades to be spoken aloud. Frank's words lingered in the room, settling between us heavier than the steam rising from our cups. "Something I never told Robert." I didn't answer at once. Instead, I listened to the sound of the clock on the mantel, the faint hiss of the kettle cooling, the quiet hum of the radio. Ordinary noises, yet now they seemed too loud, like the world was trying to cover for what he had just said. I finally sat across from him, folding my apron across my lap, my fingers restless against the fabric. "What do you mean, Frank?" He didn't look at me right away. His gaze drifted again to the photographs. The one of Robert standing in his old fishing hat, grinning like a boy. The children's birthdays. The anniversary cake we never quite managed to cut evenly. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher, almost hesitant. "I spent more time with Robert than anyone. We hunted together, worked side by side at the mill, shared stories on nights when neither of us could sleep. But there were things I never found the courage to say." He paused, lifting the cup, sipping as though the tea might give him time. I waited. My heart was a little faster now, but I told myself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. "I remember the summer of '72, he said at last. "We all went to the lake. Robert had that ridiculous canoe he swore wouldn't tip. Of course, it tipped within 5 minutes. Despite myself, I laughed softly. I remember that. He came back soaked head to toe, claiming the water was warmer than it looked." Frank's eyes crinkled with the memory, but there was something else behind them. Something that didn't belong to laughter. "You were sitting on the dock," he continued, "in that blue dress. Sun on your shoulders. Robert teased you about the freckles. But I—" His voice trailed off. The unfinished thought pressed into the silence. I shifted in my seat. "Frank," I said quietly, "why are you bringing this up now?" He set the cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. His hands lingered there, broad and weathered, as if steadying himself. "Because, Meg," he said slowly, "I've been holding memories not just of Robert, but of you. And the older I get, the heavier they've become." The room stilled. The radio's tune faded into the background. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. I thought of Robert, the way he used to grin, the way his arm felt around my shoulders, the way his presence filled a room. And here now sat the man who had shared his every secret, his every triumph, his every weakness. A man who suddenly looked at me not as a friend's widow, but something else. I shook my head, more to clear the air than to disagree. "Frank, it isn't the time." But he leaned forward slightly, his voice low, not pleading, just certain. "There's never been a right time, Meg. That's why I never said it. But I can't keep it unspoken anymore." The silence after his words was so heavy. I thought the walls themselves might bend under it. I stared at my hands, at the flour still dusting my knuckles, at the faint tremble I couldn't quite control. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. His eyes met mine then, steady, unflinching. "I just need you to know." And in that moment, something shifted inside me. Not acceptance, not rejection, just a crack. A hairline fracture in the walls I had built around my loneliness. The air felt different now. Thicker. As though every breath we took was part of a conversation neither of us had dared to speak aloud. I rose to check the oven, needing something to do, something ordinary to keep the ground beneath me. The bread had risen perfectly, golden at the edges, filling the kitchen with the scent of home. Robert used to say the smell of baking bread was proof a house was alive. As I slid the loaf onto the counter, I caught Frank watching me, not with pity, not with casual concern, but with a look that made my chest tighten. For the first time in years, I realized I was not invisible, not forgotten. And that frightened me more than the silence ever had. The loaf of bread cooled on the counter, its crust cracking softly as steam escaped into the air. I busied myself with it longer than needed, my hands fussing with the knife, the cutting board, anything to avoid the weight of Frank's gaze. But eventually there was nothing left to do. The bread sat sliced, but untouched. The tea had cooled, and the house seemed to hold its breath. When I turned, he was still there, seated in Robert's old chair, broad shoulders slouched just slightly, his hands folded over his knees. He looked as though he carried a burden that had only grown heavier with years of silence. I took my place across from him. The faded floral chair creaked beneath me, The same chair where I had rocked my grandchildren to sleep. Now it held me steady. As my heart drummed a little too fast. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was filled not with words, but with something else. A charge. Question. A memory waiting to be named. He reached for his cup. His hands shook just enough to clink the porcelain against the saucer. He lifted it slowly, sipped, and set it back down with exaggerated care, as though the tiniest noise might shatter the moment. I found myself watching his hands. Those hands had once built the fence out back with Robert. Those hands had steadied me when I slipped on the icy porch stairs. Those same hands now seemed unfamiliar. Not because they had changed, but because of what they meant in this silence. Finally I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. Why now, Frank? After all these years, why tell me this now? His eyes lifted slowly to mine. They were tired eyes, lined with the weight of years, but steady, unflinching. Because the years don't stretch out the way they used to. Because I've watched you sit in this house alone. And because I can't carry it anymore, Meg. Not without you knowing. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Knowing what? I asked, though I already felt the answer pressing against the edges of the room. His voice dropped, low and certain, that I loved Robert like a brother. But I also... He stopped, his jaw tightening, the words caught between confession and restraint. The silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. I felt it settle into my chest, heavy and alive. I looked down at my tea. The steam had thinned to wisps, curling and fading, just like the years between us. I wrapped my hands around the cup, not for warmth, but for something to hold on to. Frank, I began, but the words died in my mouth. What could I say? That I hadn't thought of this possibility? That I hadn't felt the sharp sting of loneliness? So many nights after Robert was gone? That maybe, just maybe, some part of me wanted to feel alive again? He leaned back in the chair, his gaze never leaving me. I'm not asking for answers, he said quietly. I just need to sit here with you. To let the truth breathe, even if it changes nothing. And so we sat. 2 cups of cooling tea. 2 hearts heavy with what was spoken, and what was not. The clock ticked on the mantel, marking seconds that felt like hours. Outside, the branches brushed against the window, whispering with the wind. Inside, every sound felt magnified. The shift of fabric, the faint clink of the spoon in the saucer, the steady rhythm of our breathing. I found myself remembering Robert again, but not in the way I expected. Not his laugh, not his stories. I remembered instead the way he used to look at me, quietly, with eyes that saw me even when I felt unseen. And in that silence, I realized Frank was looking at me the same way now. I set down my cup, my hand brushing the table. For just a moment, his hand moved slightly, as though drawn by instinct, stopped short, hovering in the space between us, close enough to feel, too far to touch. Neither of us closed the gap, but neither of us pulled away. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, alive with the question neither of us dared answer. And I thought to myself, this is how it begins. Not with words, not with touch, but with silence too heavy to ignore. Frank shifted in his seat, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I noticed where he had chosen to sit. Robert's chair. The armchair by the fireplace. Its fabric worn smooth by decades of evenings, by the weight of one man's body returning to it night after night. Robert's book once lived on the side table, his pipe resting in the shallow dish, the Afghan draped just so over the arm. 4 years since he passed, I hadn't let anyone sit there. Not the children when they visited. Not the neighbors when they stopped in. That chair was his. It was memory stitched into fabric. It was grief shaped like furniture. And now Frank sat there, his shoulders filling it, his hands resting where Robert's had rested, his back leaning into the same place my husband once claimed. Something inside me twisted. Part discomfort, part something I couldn't name. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just a chair. Just a man too tired to notice where he sat. But deep down I knew better. Because when I looked at Frank, I didn't just see him. I saw the way the firelight once touched Robert's face. I saw the evenings we spent together. Me knitting on the sofa. Him reading the paper. Both of us content in the quiet. But now the quiet was not contentment. It was heavy charged. filled with questions that trembled at the edges of the room. Frank leaned back, settling into the cushion with a sigh. Almost unconsciously, he reached for the afghan folded on the armrest. His fingers brushed the yarn, lingering there, as though remembering something. "That blanket," he said softly. "Your mother made it for you, didn't she?" I nodded, my throat too tight for words. Robert had always pulled that blanket over his legs in winter. I could still see him tugging at the frayed edge. Still hear his voice telling me it was warmer than any store-bought thing. Frank's hand remained on it, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "I remember Robert falling asleep here," he continued. "You covering him with it when he wouldn't admit he was tired." I closed my eyes. The image was so clear, so vivid. I almost forgot where I was. Almost. When I opened them again, Frank was watching me. Not with pity. Not with the distance of a friend. But with something rawer. "Meg," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Does it bother you that I sit here?" The question pierced the silence. My lips parted, but no answer came. Did it bother me? Yes. Because it wasn't his chair. Because it wasn't supposed to be anyone's chair but Robert's. And yet, well, because for the first time in years, the chair didn't feel like a monument to absence. It felt alive again. Occupied. Present. "I don't know," I whispered at last. The truth was too tangled to be anything else. Frank nodded slowly, accepting my uncertainty as though he expected it. "I don't mean to take what isn't mine," he said. "But I don't want to keep pretending." He leaned forward then, his elbows on his knees, his face lit by the soft glow of the lamp. "I've loved this house as much as Robert did. But it wasn't just the house, Meg. It was what was in it." The words pressed against me, heavy and undeniable. My heart thudded louder than the clock's ticking. I felt the urge to rise, to busy myself, to escape the weight of it. But my body didn't move. Instead, I sat there, watching him in Robert's chair, feeling the air shift between us. Not anger, not even shock, but something far more dangerous. Possibility. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls. Frank's eyes stayed on me, steady, unblinking, the kind of gaze that says more than words ever could. And for the first time, I wondered not if he should leave, but what would happen if he stayed. The fire had burned low, embers glowing soft and orange in the hearth. The house was quieter than I could remember, the kind of quiet that didn't comfort, but pressed against the walls, heavy weighting. Frank leaned forward in Robert's chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely, as if he was steadying himself for something he couldn't hold back anymore. I sat opposite, my teacup untouched on the table, the steam long since faded. My palms rested flat on my lap. But inside me, everything trembled. The clock ticked. Once, twice. Each second stretched too long. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice low, measured. "I've carried this for years, Meg. Decades if I'm honest. And maybe I should have buried it with Robert. But I couldn't. Not anymore." I held my breath, my chest rising but refusing to fall. "What is it you want to say?" I asked softly, though part of me feared the answer. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not the way a friend looks. Not the way a neighbor checks on a widow. But with a weight that stripped away pretense. "I loved him," Frank said firmly. "Robert was my brother in every way that mattered. But there were moments when I'd look at you, when I'd see the way you lit up a room, and I knew I was crossing lines even in my own heart." The words landed heavy. So heavy I thought they might crack the floor beneath us. I shook my head slightly, more to keep myself steady than to disagree. "Frank, you can't say that." "I have to," he insisted, his voice rough, almost breaking. "Because I can't sit in this house, look at you across from me, and keep pretending that all I feel is friendship. It isn't. It hasn't been for a long time." My throat tightened. I wanted to rise, to busy myself with the dishes, with the bread still cooling on the counter. Anything but this. But my body didn't move. Instead, I stayed frozen in the floral chair, watching him, hearing Robert's name in his voice, and feeling something inside me stir. "Do you know what it's like," Frank continued, "to walk through years, carrying love you're not allowed to name? To stand beside your best friend, laugh with him, work with him, all the while knowing your heart beats faster when his wife smiles at you. Tears stung at the corners of my eyes. I hadn't expected them. Not for this. Not for him. But they came anyway. Hot and uninvited. I don't know what you expect of me, I whispered. Nothing, he said quickly. His voice firm. But his hands shook where they rested. I don't expect anything, Meg. I just need you to know. Because silence has eaten at me more than any answer ever could. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks into the dim air. The glow touched his face, highlighting the lines carved deep by time, by work, by secrets carried too long. I stared at him, and for a moment, I didn't see Robert's friend. I saw a man, lonely in his own way, brave enough, or foolish enough, to lay his heart bare in the quiet of my living room. And worse, I saw myself reflected in him, lonely, hungry for connection, afraid of what the world might say, yet craving the feeling of being seen, of being chosen. After years of silence, my hands trembled where they rested. I pressed them together, but the shaking didn't stop. Frank's gaze softened. Meg, he said gently, if this is too much, believe, but don't ask me to take it back, because it's the truest thing I've ever spoken. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the fire brighter. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, and his, slower, heavier. I wanted to tell him to go. I wanted to tell him to stay. And I didn't dare finish the thought. Instead, I whispered the only truth I could manage. I don't know what I feel right now. Frank leaned back. Not angry, not disappointed, just patient, like a man who had waited years, and would wait longer still. The silence returned, thicker than before. Our eyes met across the small table, and in that gaze lived every question we weren't ready to answer. The fire had burned lower still, embers glowing faint against the brick. Shadows stretched long across the living room, curling up the walls like vines. The clock ticked steady on the mantel, its rhythm louder than it had ever been. Frank shifted in Robert's chair again, but this time, he didn't stay. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he rose to his feet. His hands brushed down the sides of his trousers, a small nervous gesture I had never seen in him before. He hesitated, then crossed the room. When he stopped, it wasn't across from me anymore. It was beside me, on the sofa. The cushion dipped with his weight, the fabric pulling closer. I felt the warmth of him, not touching, but near enough to sense. My breath caught. I wanted to tell him to sit back in Robert's chair, to return the room to what it was. But the words never came. Instead, we sat in silence, the inches between us alive, buzzing with questions neither of us asked aloud. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. From this close, I could see the silver in his hair, the lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes, lines of work, of loss, and of secrets finally spoken. I wrapped my hands tighter around my teacup, though the liquid inside was long gone cold. My fingers ached from holding it too tightly. Frank noticed. He reached out slowly, carefully, as if giving me every chance to pull away. His hand touched the rim of the cup, steadying it. Meg, he said softly, you don't have to carry it all alone. The words broke something in me. For so long, I had told myself I was fine. That solitude was peace. That silence was safety. But now, sitting here with him, I felt how heavy the years had been. How long it had been since anyone reached for me at all. My eyes burned. I set the cup down quickly, before my hands betrayed the tremble. When I did, his hand lingered just a moment longer on the table, close to mine. I didn't move away. The distance between us narrowed further, not by steps, but by silence, by the way his shoulder nearly brushed mine, by the way his presence filled the space beside me, warm and certain. I could smell him now, the faint scent of soap, a trace of tobacco, something undeniably him. Frank, I whispered, my voice unsteady, this isn't simple. He turned his head toward me, his gaze steady, unflinching. Nothing worth holding ever is. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pressed close, alive, like the air itself was waiting. My hands rested in my lap, nervous, restless, and then his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, until it rested just over mine. warm, solid, moving. I froze. Not because I wanted to pull away, but because I didn't. My breath came shallow. My heart thudded against my ribs, louder than the clock. I thought of Robert, of his laughter, of the years we shared. But I also thought of the emptiness that followed, the hollow nights, the ache of loneliness. And here was Frank, not asking, not demanding, just offering. A hand over mine, steady, patient. The room seemed to lean in around us. The fire cracked softly. The clock ticked on. But everything else fell away. I didn't look at him, but I felt his gaze. I felt the weight of it, the way it searched for an answer I couldn't yet give. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Finally he whispered, so low I almost didn't hear it. Meg, tell me to stop. And I will. The words trembled in the air, settling heavy in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. And in that silence, in that choice left unspoken, I realized the line between us had already begun to blur. His hand was still over mine, steady, warm, patient. The weight of it was not heavy, but it pressed into me all the same, like a truth I could no longer avoid. The fire cracked low in the hearth, the last embers glowing faint red. The house was hushed, every creak of the wood, every tick of the clock, magnified by the silence between us. I should have pulled away. Every part of me knew that. And yet I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch. Let the stillness breathe. Frank shifted slightly, leaning closer. Not so much that we touched, but close enough that I felt the warmth of his shoulder. Close enough that I caught the rhythm of his breath. Steady and grounding, but unsteady too, as if he was holding back. Meg, he said softly, his voice a low tremor in the quiet. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to dishonor Robert. But I can't keep pretending. My throat tightened. The mention of Robert's name pulled me back and forth at once, into memory, and into the present. I whispered, though I wasn't sure to whom. This isn't right. But it doesn't feel wrong either. His gaze met mine then. Steady, unflinching. For a long moment, neither of us moved. But the air between us shifted. Alive with possibility. He lifted his hand slowly, as though testing fate itself, and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I should have turned away, but I didn't. I sat frozen, eyes locked on his, caught between the past I clung to, and the present that pressed against me. Do you ever think, Frank whispered, that maybe love doesn't end with age? That maybe it finds us again, in ways we never expected? The words hung in the air, thick and trembling. I swallowed hard, my heart racing faster than I wanted. Frank, I began, but the words faltered. I didn't know what came after his name. His hand lingered near mine again, his fingers brushing against my skin this time. Not fully, not boldly, just enough to remind me what it felt like to be touched, what it felt like not to be alone. The room seemed to close in, not darker, not smaller, but closer, as though the house itself leaned in to listen. For a fleeting moment, thought he might kiss me. The thought alone startled me, made my breath catch sharp in my throat. His face was near enough, not close, but near enough, that if I leaned in just slightly, the space between us would disappear. My heart pounded so loud, I wondered if he heard it too. But then, just as the moment tilted forward, he stopped. Frank leaned back slowly, his hand pulling away, his breath unsteady. His gaze dropped, as though afraid of what might happen if he looked at me a moment longer. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty, carried all that almost happened, and all that didn't. I sat still, my hands trembling in my lap, my chest aching with the weight of restraint. Relief and disappointment warred inside me, neither winning. Frank spoke at last, his voice barely above a whisper. If I cross that line, Meg, I don't know if I can turn back. I closed my eyes. I didn't answer, because the truth was, neither did I. The fire had gone out. Only the faint glow of embers remained, casting shadows that flickered across the walls. The house felt heavier in the dark, its silence no longer gentle, but urgent. I rose slowly, my knees stiff from sitting too long. Without a word, I walked to the kitchen, needing movement, needy air. Frank followed. I heard the quiet sound of his steps on the old floorboards, steady, unhurried, but deliberate. In the kitchen, I busied myself with the bread, though it had long cooled. I set plates on the counter, poured water into glasses, anything to keep my hands from trembling. He stood in the doorway, not intruding, not rushing, just there. Finally he stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of the counter as he passed. The faint scrape of wood beneath his palm was louder than it should have been. "Meg," he said softly, "you don't have to pretend with me. Not tonight." I froze. The knife in my hand hovered over the bread, but I didn't cut. His words pressed too close, too honest. I turned and found him only a step away. The space between us had vanished, narrowed down to inches. I could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness of his breath. My heart raced, louder than the clock in the hall. I wanted to step back. I wanted to tell him to go, but I didn't move. His hand lifted, hesitant at first, then sure. He brushed a strand of hair from my cheek, his fingers lingering just a second too long. The touch was simple, and yet, it felt like the world tilted beneath me. "Frank," I whispered, my voice breaking, "this isn't." But before I could finish, he spoke, his words low, rough with feeling. "I've wanted to tell you for years, wanted to hold this back, but being here now, I can't keep it in." The silence swelled around us. The house seemed to lean in, holding its breath with mine. His hand dropped from my cheek, but then it found mine instead. Our fingers tangled, tentative, trembling, yet certain. The shock of it stole my breath. So simple, so dangerous. We stood like that, two hands joined in the dim kitchen, while everything unspoken surged between us. I thought of Robert, of the years we built together, the love that anchored me. But I also thought of the years after him. The silence, the emptiness, the way I'd convinced myself. Loneliness was just another form of living. And now here was Frank, his hand steady in mine, his eyes searching my face for an answer I didn't yet know how to give. The clock struck in the hall, each time louder than the last. It was as though time itself wanted to remind me that moments like this didn't wait forever. Frank leaned closer, so close I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin. For a heartbeat, I thought the line would finally break. I thought his lips might find mine, and the silence would shatter. But then he stopped. His forehead rested lightly against mine instead, his breath uneven, his hand still holding mine. We stood like that, motionless, caught on the edge of something too large to name. His voice was a whisper against the quiet. "If I go further, Meg, there's no going back." My eyes closed. I couldn't answer. Not yes, not no, just silence, thick, trembling, alive. And in that silence, I realized we had reached the breaking point. Not yet crossed, but close enough that nothing would ever feel the same again. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. Frank's hand was still around mine, his eyes searching me, waiting. I should have spoken, should have said yes, should have said no, but the words refused to come. Instead, I just stood there, heart pounding so hard I thought he must hear it. "Meg," he whispered, his breath brushing so close, made my knees weaken. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't pretend anymore either." The silence pressed heavier. I closed my eyes. For the briefest moment, I let myself lean just an inch closer. Just enough to feel the warmth of him. Just enough to wonder, what if? The kettle had long gone quiet. The world outside moved on. But inside, time held its breath. I felt the air shift again, the way it only does when something is about to break. And in that moment, I knew nothing in this house would ever feel the same again. The next thing I remember, the faint creak of the floorboards, the sound of a door closing softly down the hall. Was it mine? Was it his? Or was it both of ours? Closing on one life, and opening to something unnamed? Even now I couldn't tell you. And maybe I don't want to. Some truths live best in the spaces between words. Some answers are only meant to be felt. All I know is when I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I could still feel his hand in mine. Warm, steady, unforgettable. And whatever line we had or hadn't crossed, the world on the other side of it was already waiting. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Some nights leave questions that never get answered, and sometimes that's the only way the story makes sense. If you'd like to hear more true stories like this, subscribe to my channel, as the next one might be even harder to forget.